Analytics are great, but don't let them be the foundation on which you play fantasy football. They're best utilized as a peripheral tool only.
Tyler Boyd's dip in production last year better correlates with Andy Dalton being off the field than it does with A.J. Green being off the field, despite public perception.
You can't watch just highlight film because highlight film only shows the good things. Watch the player's actual game tape because you see the good and the bad.
In 7 games in 2018, where all 3 starting Rams receivers were healthy, Brandon Cooks led the trio in targets, receptions, receiving yards, and total PPR points by a considerable margin.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome into the newest episode of the RotoBros 2020 NFL Draft Scouting Brief Series. You guys, like as always, know the drill by now. You know the drill. We got another prospect coming at you tonight. This time it's a quarterback. Jacob Eason of the Washington Huskies is going to be the focus of tonight's scouting brief. And I know this is a guy that a lot of you have really wanted to hear about. There's really 3 big-time quarterbacks left in this class, big-name quarterbacks, left to cover. There's Eason, okay, who we're going to do tonight. There's Jake Fromm, who is actually up next. I'll go ahead and give that away. So he'll be the next one. And then we got Jalen Hurts a little later on. Some of you may count Anthony Gordon from Washington State. We'll get to his as well. But, of course, he's not one of the big-name quarterbacks, though when I was at the Senior Bowl, he did play pretty well. But tonight, this is the scouting brief for Jacob Eason, so we're going to get to this, guys. Jacob Eason is quite the prospect. He was a guy, I'll be honest with you, he was a guy that I really thought was going to come into this draft class and be my number 2 quarterback behind Tua. Of course, that was before Joe Burrow happened. So here's the deal with Jacob Eason. He transferred from UGA to Washington, so he was at UGA, okay, and he was the starter. He was starting over Jake Fromm. Okay, Jacob Eason got hurt. Fromm came in, played too good for Kirby Smart to bench, and then Jacob transfers over to Washington to play with Chris Peterson, sits out a year. Meanwhile, back over at UGA, Justin Fields comes in. He can't steal the job from Jake Fromm, transfers to Ohio State, and Fromm ends up defeating 2 highly touted quarterbacks on UGA's campus to remain the starter for the Bulldogs. But this is not on Jake Fromm. We'll get to that story in his scouting brief coming up next. But this is about Jacob Eason, so let's get to it, shall we? Look, 6'6", 227. This is a guy that physically is built for the part, and he looks the part. If you guys will remember on Justin Herbert's scouting brief, I told you guys, look, if there is a quarterback that you could build physically from the ground up, you don't build one better than Justin Herbert from a physicality standpoint. You guys already heard Herbert's brief that I've done. So there's a lot of question marks for me there. But physically, he's, the best prospect in the draft physically at the position. And so Eason is kind of sort of that way. He's not as mobile. We'll get to that in a little bit as Justin Herbert, but the size is there. He does have a very strong NFL comparison, in my opinion. I'll get to that toward the end of the brief, so stick around for that as well. But 6'6", 227, and I want to go ahead and get this out of the way real quick, guys, okay? Strongest arm in the draft by a considerable margin, okay? There are only 2 quarterbacks. In fact, there are only 2 quarterbacks in this draft that are going to even be close to Jacob Eason when it comes to arm strength. And that's Steven Montez of Colorado and Jordan Love of Utah State, who I've already done a brief on. Montez, his brief will come later on. But those guys have huge arms, cannons for an arm. They've got cannons for an arm, okay? Jacob Eason's got a rocket launcher. This guy can absolutely sling it. He probably does have the strongest arm out of any quarterback in the last several classes. And that is not an exaggeration. So if you're not familiar with Jacob Eason, because you might not be, a lot of you guys may not be on the West Coast. You guys may not be up, and turn on a Pac-12 game featuring Jacob Eason and the Huskies at 10:15, 10:30 at night, just kicking off, getting over it at 1:30, 2 o'clock in the morning Eastern. So, a lot of people are not too familiar with Jacob Eason. Now, I live in the Atlanta area, so, of course, Athens is right down the road. So, I was watching every start Eason was making for the Bulldogs in his brief career there. So, I'm very familiar with Jacob Eason, but not everybody may be, and that's just kind of how it is with these West Coast quarterbacks. Not everybody may be too familiar with them, especially when these guys aren't really getting, it's not like USC or something, when they're getting a lot of primetime games. Justin Herbert was getting some primetime action, but Jacob Eason didn't get a lot of that, obviously. He's got the 10:30 kickoffs, the late night kickoffs on the West Coast. So a lot of people may not have been able to have their eyes on him, but I promise you, this guy's arm is unbelievable from a strength standpoint. Okay. It's almost like he doesn't know his own strength. And I think that kind of leads to why he's he's a bit of an inconsistent passer. He doesn't always throw with a lot of touch. That was an issue I mentioned back in a previous scouting brief about Cam Newton. If you remember right, Cam Newton didn't have he had that problem too coming out of Auburn. He didn't throw with a lot of touch, right? He was one of the hugest mismatches in college football history. But it's not like he succeeded because he was great at putting touch on his passes. He wasn't. Jacob Eason is kind of the same way. He doesn't throw with a whole lot of touch. He just throws with a lot of power, right? But look, he'll sometimes trust his arm too much. And while he has the ability to thread the needle and put the ball on a line, he will sometimes be a bit reckless, and he'll try to push the ball to his target before the defender gets there. It's almost like he's saying, well, I know this isn't a great decision, but the ball should beat the defender to my target if I throw it really, really hard. When you watch him, it's almost like that's what's happening. And look, I don't dislike Jacob. I want to go ahead and preface that right now. I don't dislike Jacob Eason, but there are some things that from his game that are concerns. And I think that we will see in the NFL, we are going to see, he's not going to be Mr. Consistency. I don't think he's going to be Joe or Tua in that aspect. I think Joe and Tua week in, week out, you are probably, especially Joe Burrow, you're going to know what you're going to get. You know that you're going to get, above average play at the quarterback position. But I think what we're likely going to see from Jacob Eason is weeks where he's just phenomenal and other weeks where he's just like, what is going on? Almost like a Jameis Winston sort of thing. Maybe not that schizophrenic, but I do think that Eason's got unfortunately has that gene in him. But again, he's, like I said, it's almost like he doesn't know his own strength, because that's really what pops off the screen is his arm strength. But because he doesn't throw with a lot of touch, that really leads again to him being a bit inconsistent. And he has a tendency to commit, as far as I'm concerned, the biggest quarterback sin. The biggest quarterbacking sin for any quarterback prospect coming out. And a lot of you guys already know what it is. Staring down receivers and not properly going through your progressions. That, to me, when I evaluate a quarterback, that is the number one thing that I'm looking for. The very first thing when I turn on a quarterback's tape, do they go through their progressions on a consistent basis? And do they avoid staring down their receivers? And Eason, unfortunately, he has that problem. He's very hit or miss in this aspect, though. So there's some times where you'll watch 3 minutes of game tape and you're like, my God, he goes through his progressions great. And then the next 7 minutes of it is him locking down on his receiver, okay, and giving away exactly what he plans on doing to the defense. And of course, that's fixable. Quarterback coaches are going to work with quarterbacks on that, but it's definitely, it's a hard thing to fix. That's a bad habit for quarterbacks. And we've seen so many quarterbacks. That's why there's so many quarterbacks in the NFL that struggle with that, because it is a hard thing to fix. Imagine how much better someone like Jameis Winston would be if he didn't do that, right? Now he's got his, some other issues as well in his game, but I mean that's a big part of it, and he's a good example of that. But again, like I said, he's very hit or miss. So sometimes you'll watch him and you'll see his head moving, and he's looking through his targets, and other times he's just not, and you're wondering what the heck's going on here, man. Look, under pressure, he will make a lot of errant throws. He tends to overthrow his targets quite often. When under pressure, he will overthrow them because he's falling back and he's overcompensating. He's allowing his arm to overcompensate for, the fact that he's, leaning back or throwing off balance, and he ends up, his arm's so strong, he ends up throwing, 10, 20 yards over his receiver's head. So he does that quite often. He doesn't always throw with a clean, even base either. So, I think this also assists in the fact where in hurting him kind of in this aspect. His accuracy really as a whole is about average because of this, I think. And he's not going to put the majority of the footballs on a dime, like Joe Burrow or Tua Tagovailoa will. Okay. He's going to thread them through the air, and they're going to slice through the air like a hot knife through butter. Okay. But it's not always, the accuracy is just not always going to be there. I actually think Justin Herbert is a more accurate passer on a more consistent basis as well. And remember, when we did Herbert's brief, what was the magic word with Herbert? Consistency or inconsistency. A very inconsistent football player. Well, Jacob Eason's kind of the same way, especially when it comes to throwing the football. Now, in comparing those guys, Justin did complete 66.8% of his passes, while Jacob was sitting there at about 64.2%. So Justin Herbert was a little more accurate from that standpoint. Now, of course, completion percentage doesn't always, tell you the whole story. Of course, it's just one measly stat. But if you go off that, they were very close. But Herbert was a little more accurate in that aspect. But look, Jacob Eason had the epitome of an up and down season. It's weird because he played great against Oregon, against Justin Herbert. He played great in that game. It was a close loss, but he played great. But then he folded against, go back and you can watch the tape of these games, and it's like, is this the same guy? But he played great against Oregon, and then he folds like wet cardboard against teams like USC, Utah, Oregon State. In fact, I would say the Oregon State Utah tape is probably, those two tapes are probably his worst. And I get Utah. Utah was a solid team this past year. Okay, so I can excuse a bad game, but Oregon State, there just wasn't. Go back and watch that game. There's just not a whole lot of excuses there. He also has a tendency to kind of when he rears back to throw, he'll kind of pause for a brief moment before he lets the ball go. And this is a terrible, terrible thing for a quarterback to do, because what it does is it gives the defenders an extra second to kind of process what you're about to do. And these defenders can adjust accordingly, right? I mean, these corners are just as fast as most of these wide receivers anyway. So you're giving them an extra second to jump the route, and that's obviously going to end up in a lot of, it's not going to end up the way that you intend it to, especially when you're not the most accurate passer in the world. And especially after you've been staring down the receivers for the last 4 seconds, okay? And then you have a hitch in your throw. And he doesn't always do it. But if you want to see what I'm talking about, you can go, I think it's the Cal tape. The Cal tape from this year. Go right around the 135 mark, I believe is where it was. It may be a little bit far, but just start at like a minute 35 in the tape, and you'll see it against Cal. So he does this, and it results in an interception. And it's plain as day to see. It just kind of hesitates. And look, I know sometimes, you go up to throw the ball, and you're like, ooh, no, I don't want to do that. Oh, yeah, I do want to do that. So you kind of hesitate for a minute. It happens. but that's not the only time he does it, you'll find. So that's something that's a little bit of a nitpick that I kind of had, just because it's the way he plays the game. Again, stares down his receivers, doesn't go through his progressions, and he's not the most accurate passer in the world. So, when you have a habit like that, it's only going to make the other things kind of grow. It's going to make those other issues glaring, and it's going to snowball into bigger problems during the game. So that's really the reason I bring that up. And when he does try to throw with more touch, many times he'll leave it floating in the air for way too long, which of course we see that all the time in the NFL. That's of course going to result in more dangerous throws. So I think he notices that he, puts a lot of juice on the ball when he throws it. And I feel like he knows that he can't do that all the time. He can't get away with doing that all the time. So he's going to have to throw with some touch, especially, in the red zone on those throws like fades, like end zone fades, things of that nature. Even, just normal deep balls, normal fade routes. I mean, those are the type of things that, you're going to have to throw with a little bit of touch, especially when your guy's wide open, because you don't want to be the reason your guy, can't get the ball. So those are a couple things that, he also needs to sort of fix. And you can't always teach touch. You just can't. And so sometimes you either have it or you don't. So that's one thing that I worry about with Jacob Eason as well. He's got a good pump fake that'll make defenders bite. He shows that a lot. He showed it a lot in the the Utah game in the red zone a couple times. So he's got that working for him. So that's good. Kind of reminds me a little bit of Ben Roethlisberger in that aspect. They both got the size, both got the big arm, and of course we know Ben is a great play action pump fake passer as well, and that's really the same with Eason. He excels in both of those areas. He has experience under center and in the shotgun. Obviously, they were in the shotgun the majority of the time in Chris Peterson's offense, but he is a little bit of a traditionalist in a sense where he doesn't mind his quarterback going under center, and he wants him to. So Eason does have that experience. So when he is under center in the NFL, it's not going to be brand new to him. And his footwork is generally pretty good. He generally does a good job feeling the pressure, getting away from it. The only thing is he's not very mobile. Okay. He's likely to run like a 5-second 40. And for me, this is where the NFL comparison comes in. For me, he has the mobility of Nick Foles. And that's who my NFL comparison for him is. And when I turn on the tape of Nick Foles, I see it. To me, it's pretty evident. They are very, very similar. They play a very similar type of game. I think from a speed standpoint, that's kind of how they are. Now, look, Nick has shown before that he can, scramble around and kind of, make some things happen sometimes. But you got to remember, he was also in Doug Peterson's offense, and that's part two of what I'm getting ready to say. So Eason, it's not like he's Phillip Rivers, okay, in the pocket. He's not a complete, he doesn't have cinder blocks tied to his ankles. But at the same time, he's not even Matthew Stafford fast, okay? So that's something that I think teams are going to look at as well, because again, I say it all the time, in this day and age, in this NFL, you can be a pass-first pocket passer, that's fine, but you've also got to have some mobility with you. And Tua's got that. Joe Burrow has that. Daniel Jones has that. Obviously, Kyler Murray has that. These types of guys are pass-first quarterbacks, that have a little bit of mobility to them. Even a guy like Gardner Minshew has it to him. He's not the fastest guy in the world, but he's mobile enough to make things happen when the play breaks down. I don't think we're going to be seeing a lot of Jacob Eason scrambling outside the pocket and making things happen with his legs. But we've seen Nick Foles do it a time or two, and I think it's because of the scheme he played in and who he played for. Okay? Jacob Eason, much like Nick Foles, guys like that really need to be put in a disciplined NFL system. Exactly like what Doug Peterson did for Nick Foles. Again, they look eerily similar on film. They have very similar measurables. They struggle and succeed really in the same areas. They both have cannon arms, but struggle with accuracy and consistency. Nick's accuracy was clearly better because, when he was in a system like Doug's. And from a mobility standpoint, like I said earlier, there's a lot of similarities there as well. They just don't excel, in that aspect. Eason also, he throws with a much wider base for the most part, so that's one difference. And I think that helps him get a little bit more air under the ball than Nick Foles has in the past. But I think, to be honest with you guys, I think an offense like Doug Peterson's, that has some West Coast scheme elements to it, what I think would likely be best, the best type of fit for him. Okay, there's a lot of people that I've heard talk about Tampa. They're always talking about, I think because what they're doing is they're looking at Jacob Eason as a gunslinger, and they're looking at his huge arm as a huge downfield threat. But what people aren't realizing is that Jameis Winston has that. He's a strong arm quarterback that struggles with accuracy and consistency and decision making. So why would you want to put a guy like Jacob Eason, who has some of the same struggles, in the same offense? It doesn't make any sense. It does not make any sense to do that. And that's not what the Tampa offense needs. Maybe from a fantasy perspective, maybe we would all love to see that. Okay, I wouldn't complain from a fantasy perspective, but from a reality perspective, from a realistic Bruce Arians is the head coach perspective, sure, he's going to want a guy that can push it downfield, but I think he has seen enough of Jameis Winston to know, okay, a guy that pushes downfield is nice, but we need some more consistency. I can't have a guy turning the ball over all the time, and at that alarming rate that Jameis does. And I don't know that Eason wouldn't do that in an offense like that. I think when he is in a more disciplined NFL offense, short to intermediate throws, okay? And there's a design around him. There's a team around him. It's not where he's just sitting in the shotgun or coming under center, dropping back and just chucking it 60 yards down the field to Mike Evans. I don't think that's a good idea for him. I don't think that's a good fit for him. So I really hope for his sake that he does not go to Tampa, because if he goes to somewhere like Tampa, I think his career is pretty much set. He is going to be an up and down quarterback in Tampa for a couple years. Okay, once the Jameis experiment is over, and that's it. That's all she wrote. And they're going to be looking to draft another franchise quarterback in 3 or 4 years, if that. I just don't see the consistency if he goes to a place like Tampa. I don't. I think if he were to go to a place like Indianapolis with Frank Reich, I think that would be ideal for Jay. I would love to see Jacob Eason there, and he could succeed from a fantasy standpoint for you fantasy guys. He could do that, but he needs a disciplined, structured offensive scheme, not a wide open attack downfield, throw it 150 damn times down the field to Evans and Godwin and, OJ Howard whenever he learns how to play football. That's not the type of offense he needs to be in. So Jacob Eason, for me, again, needs structure, just like Nick Foles did. And what did Nick Foles do with structure and talent around him? He won a Super Bowl. I mean, hey, he won a Super Bowl. Now, not everybody's an offensive genius like Doug Peterson. Frank Reich is, though. He's an offensive genius. So Jacob Eason to Indianapolis, I think, makes a ton of sense. Now, I currently have Jordan Love going to the Colts in the first round, but obviously things can change between now and April. But I do think that a place like that would be perfect for a guy like Jacob Eason. So, guys, that's kind of where I am with Jacob Eason. I see him having sort of that Nick Foles career. I think he could have a little bit of a better career than Nick Foles, start a little longer than Foles did, be a little more successful. Well, I won't say that because Foles has a Super Bowl ring, but you know what I mean. I don't think that Jacob Eason, when we look down the road in 7 or 8 years, is going to be starting for the same team that drafted him and being a perennial Pro Bowl quarterback. I don't see that out of him anymore. Once upon a time I did when he first went to Washington, but it just didn't happen for him. And I don't see that on film. He's got a higher ceiling than Nick Foles, I think. He's got a higher ceiling than Ryan Mallett, who was another comparison, another popular NFL comparison that I've seen for Eason. But I think, again, his ceiling's a lot higher than Ryan Mallett's was, and Nick Foles. But I do think that what we're going to see is maybe a starter for a year or two. He comes in, starts as a backup, okay? Maybe probably behind, obviously, Jacoby Brissett for a year. And if Brissett struggles, or after, going into 2021, they decide to go with Eason, and this is all a guess if he goes to Indianapolis. This is just kind of a hypothetical scenario here. But that's kind of the career that I see for Jacob Eason. So from a fantasy perspective, I always end on this. Where would we take him in the draft? If it's a super flex 2 QB dynasty and I need a quarterback and Tua and Joe and Justin and Love are all gone, Eason's next up for me. I'm not taking Jake Fromm over him. I'm not taking Jalen Hurts over him. Okay? Maybe that's a little foreshadowing for you guys of the scouting briefs you can expect from Fromm and Hurts. But I don't, he's fifth for me. He's a fifth guy, and I don't know that he's even really that close to Jordan Love, to be honest with you. So he's the fifth quarterback off the board. It may be 11th or 12th overall pick at best. And depending on landing spot, I mean, he could go all the way to the end of the second. I don't know. But I would not, personally, I probably would not draft him in the first round. So that's kind of where I am on Jacob Eason. But guys, look, he's a good football player. He just has some consistency things to work on, some decision-making things to work on as well. I think he can be a high-quality backup quarterback of the NFL. And again, I always say it, there's a place in the league for those guys. But I don't think Jacob Eason's place is high-quality or really even quality NFL starting quarterback. I think we'll see some great games from him at some point as a starter, but we're also going to see him just absolutely wet the bed sometimes. So I think that's kind of what we're getting. It's going to be just too up and down, I think, for a lot of people's liking. So guys, anyway, that's all I got on Jacob Eason, so hopefully you enjoyed it. Thanks for listening. If you have any questions about Jacob or any of the other prospects we've done so far, or hell, even any other prospects we have coming up that we haven't done yet, feel free to hit me up on Twitter at RotoBros Chris. You can also find me on Facebook at the Fantasy Sports community, FSA Fantasy Sports Advice and Analysis. Go to Facebook, type in FSA Fantasy. The group will pop right up, and you'll be a part of the largest, most active fantasy sports community on the planet. Also, of course, check out the RotoBros Patreon, where you'll get all the goodies. The Dynasty Podcast is coming, folks. The Dynasty Podcast with myself and Mark is coming up. We're going to be talking rookies. We're going to be talking dynasty strategy. We're going to be talking, as a commish, how to properly set up and run your dynasty league. We're going to be taking your questions on dynasty questions as well, because I know there's always a lot of those. So definitely be looking forward to that, and you're going to get all of that, of course, with the RotoBros Patreon as well. So definitely check that out. $5 a month. It is well worth it. Guys, thank you so much for hanging out. I hope you enjoyed the episode. I hope you know a little bit more about Jacob Eason and what you can expect from him. As always, guys, enjoy the night. Enjoy the rest of the scouting briefs to come. And as always, keep balling, baby.